Welcome to this third webinar of the European Centre for Modern Languages, the ECML, which will be on the most recent recommendation of the Council of Europe in the field of language education. Recommendation on the importance of plurilingual and intercultural education for democratic culture. A recommendation which in particular speaks about the major implications on initial and further education of teachers. My name is Serva Breslin. I'm the Executive Director of the ECML and I'm also Head of Language Policies of the Council of Europe. In the field of plurilingualism, which is in the heart of this recommendation, I'm now going to speak in French, so sorry, I will commit some mistakes. There will be some wrong accent. I will speak a bit slowly. The first webinar on the recommendation spoke on the major messages aiming at decision makers. In the framework of the second webinar, Professor David Little delivered some analysis of the definition of plurilingual and intercultural education, which viewed the foundation stone of that recommendation, in particular what it means to education and society, because that is exactly the purpose of this recommendation. In a while, I'll hand over to our keynote speaker for today, Professor Mirjam Egli. She's Director of the Didactic Chair for Foreign Languages at the Haute École des Sciences Appliquées in northwest Switzerland. She works as an expert for the Council of Europe in the field of education. Language education has been doing so for a few years. But before I hand over to Mirjam, I think it is important maybe to also explain the background and some context which is indispensable in order to fully understand and place this recommendation. If you already listened in during the first or second webinar, or if maybe you consulted the webinars later, you might be familiar with this already, but still it seems to be useful to bring them in once again, because for many of you it's the first contact with this recommendation. So first of all, let me tell you what the Council of Europe has in mind and why the Council of Europe has drafted this recommendation. The Council of Europe, as we know, is the key European organization in the field of human rights, democracy and rule of law, and is also the oldest European intergovernmental organization. 46 member states and 700 million of people in Europe are represented. All member states have signed the European Human Rights Convention. The Council of Europe was founded in 1949, directly after the end of the Second World War, hoping to safeguard peace in the world. Today, however, there are serious threats to such peace. The Council of Europe is aiming at protecting human rights, democracy and rule of law in Europe. In order to do so, there are conventions and charters, like the Convention on Prevention of Violence against Women or the Convention on Cybercrime. There are those legal instruments which are not binding, but there are also some recommendations. And of course, a recommendation is what the term says, because they are not legally binding, but are adopted by the foreign affairs ministers of the member states and will be implemented by the member states. There is the adaptation of these tools, and there are also some projects in order to build up capacities in the member states. It happens quite often that the Council of Europe be mixed up with some other European bodies. The Council of Europe is not the European Council. The European Council is the decision-making body of the European Union. The European Union has 27 member states presently. No country has never been within the European Union without having been a member of the Council of Europe before. So there are two completely different organizations, but of course their missions are complementary and both very often work in closest cooperation. The European Council is the decision-making body of the European Union, whereas the Committee of Ministers is the decision-making body of the Council of Europe. On the 2nd February last year, the Committee of Ministers adopted the new recommendation in the field of language education. But before speaking about the Committee of Ministers, there had been a long process. Such process was supervised by a working group, and Mirjam was in that group and by a drafting committee in which I was allowed to work. The text was then also presented to the Education Committee in Strasbourg and to the ECML's governing board in Graz. It then also took up some comments worded by representatives of the member states. And now we are having a text which has satisfied all member states, which is an excellent example of multilateral cooperation and successful one. But what is the purpose of this new recommendation? What is its meaning and interest? Why is it so necessary today? A new recommendation is adopted when the Council of Europe has identified a common European issue and when it believes that a new political instrument is needed. The idea is not only to bring this up high on the political agenda, but it also has to give an impetus for its resolution. But what problem is it? Let's go over to the raison d'être of this recommendation. Two specific aspects are addressed which are indeed worrying within the Council of Europe. First, the tendency of public authorities and civil society to believe that the proficiency of one additional language is sufficient as long as that language is English. Second issue, the populistic notion according to which the proficiency of minority languages or languages of migrants, so present in more and more pluralistic societies of the day, does damage to social cohesion. And these two aspects, of course, show a major preoccupation, and that is a clear and worrying decline of democracy. Quoting here the Secretary General of the Council of Europe. And this has been aggravated by COVID even and also, of course, by the war in Ukraine. We see that the difficulty not only resides within schools, universities and establishments and institutions, but also in society as such. That is why this new recommendation is a global one. It's the first holistic recommendation in the field of language education. The field of application is, of course, very wide. All languages, all sectors of education, a wide range of stakeholders being concerned. But the objective of this webinar, of course, is not to highlight issues as such, but rather solutions. What then can we concretely do in the field of initial and further education of teachers in order to make sure that our language education be really plurilingual and intercultural and contributes actively to the wider objective, which means to strengthen democracy. It's exactly this point which will be covered by Mirjam in her presentation. You can, of course, use the chat function in English or in French for your comments and for asking your questions. My colleagues will, of course, show you the necessary links. They will also gather your questions, and we will do our best in order to reply at the end of the webinar. Now I hand over to Mirjam. Thank you very much.
Oui, Myriam, ça marche.
Très bien. Alors, merci beaucoup, Sarah, pour cette
Thank you very much,
introduction.
Sarah, for these words of introduction showing the context and framework of this recommendation. Thanks also once again for the invitation which I've taken up with pleasure. I'm very happy to present the recommendation in the field of initial and further education of teachers. I'm a teacher trainer myself. Nowadays, I'm a didactic researcher in the field of foreign languages and applied linguistics. And I worked in the German-speaking part of Switzerland before, in the field of foreign languages and in the field of primary teacher educations at a école pédagogique in Switzerland. So let me show you my presentation. Let me share my screen.
Voici donc le titre.
This is the official title of the recommendation on the importance of plurilingual and intercultural education for democratic culture.
Je commencerai par rappeler quelques
First, let me maybe speak about some key concepts of the recommendation as to the importance of plurilingual and intercultural education. Then I'll deal with the three questions, which are: what are specific recommendations as to teacher education? What are the implications for teacher education programs? And how to implement these recommendations in initial and further teacher education. And there I'd like to share some examples. When I speak about examples, first of all I will be speaking about what I know from my own experience. I will then maybe also speak about our own production and also about some tools, primarily of the Council of Europe. This is of course a partial and not holistic choice and selection, and you will also see that these slides not only have text, and we have been speaking about this with Sarah. These slides should also be used later as resources without an oral comment. At the end there will of course be a short summary and some conclusions. Let me first maybe speak about point 1, some key concepts of the recommendation. If maybe you listen to David Little's webinar, or if you read the recommendation already, you might know that in part 3 of the annex there, and also in the explanatory memorandum, there are such definitions as to the plurilingual repertoire. The idea is of course that in the center of plurilingual and intercultural education there has to be a linguistic repertoire of the learners in which languages interrelate and interact. Here, this also stems from the recommendation itself. Here you see in bold letters some important points which are not in the recommendation. The rest is official quotes. The vision, of course, is a holistic view of the linguistic repertoire of learners, a repertoire of resources where languages interrelate and interact in a dynamic manner, and all languages are of course addressed. Languages and cultures that learners bring with them, including sign, minority and migrant languages and cultures, languages of schooling, the most important part in the repertoire. Within a society, it's the dominant language which is crucial for school success. Furthermore, of course, also regional, minority and other languages and cultures that are part of the curriculum. Then other foreign languages, modern and classical, and other languages and cultures that are not present in school and not part of the official curriculum. All that is in the heart of this recommendation. What you see here graphically shown is the platform of resources and references for plurilingual and intercultural education, and this is a systemic view and analysis of what we are speaking about. Languages of schooling being in the center and everything else around them. Plus we have language as a subject matter and languages of other subject matters. Here we see some key principles of plurilingual and intercultural education, which I'd also like to address because this is the background of the recommendation and its cornerstone. And they are summarized within the recommendation, and they are always addressed within the Council of Europe in the field of plurilingual and intercultural education. So it is essential to education for democratic culture, respects and values linguistic and cultural diversity, promotes language awareness and language sensitivity across the curriculum, so between languages and also between sectors of education and levels of them, encourages critical reflection on cultural diversity. Plurilingual and intercultural education helps to foster critical digital literacy and digital citizenship, encourages learner autonomy and values the learner's voice, and supports the inclusion of disadvantaged and marginalized learners on an equal footing with other learners. These are, in a condensed manner, the key principles and values of the Council of Europe which are addressed in the field of plurilingual and intercultural education. This then makes me speak about the second point, the 9 measures addressed in the recommendation as to initial and further education of teachers. These measures are quite succinct, and I've been showing them here as they are within the recommendation so that you can find them later on as well. The first measure is that in their own training and education they have to address the concepts which are addressed before, like assigning a central role to the concepts of and principles on which such education rests, including the language dimension of all curriculum subjects. The second measure is plurilingual and intercultural education, with its holistic approach as to the repertoire and values, always requires challenging attitudes, beliefs, and preconceptions about language, language learning, plurilingualism, culture, and intercultural learning. Furthermore, the third measure says or speaks about developing student teachers and teachers' own plurilingual and intercultural competencies as an essential dimension of their pedagogical competencies. The fourth measure means to engage teachers in a detailed exploration of what plurilingual and intercultural approaches to education entail in terms of classroom practice. Measure 5. Such education helps teachers by means of such inclusive and holistic approach to develop the pedagogical competencies needed to manage linguistic and cultural diversity for the benefit of all pupils and students. Measure number 6, in order to allow for a full integration of everyone, it is necessary to help teachers to develop the pedagogical competencies needed to support a democratic classroom culture that fosters autonomous learning and critical thinking and makes space for the inclusion of the learner's voice. The 7th measure speaks about practice of assessment. This is one of the key conditions and is in agreement with the principle addressed before. Because here teachers are helped to develop assessment competencies that take account of plurilingual and intercultural learning. Measure number 8, to encourage teacher mobility as an important aspect of professional development. And finally, measure number 9, developing teachers' competence in action research so that they can contribute to the evidence-based development of educational policy and practice. These 9 measures then are listed in the recommendation, and what then are their implications for teacher education programs? Including plurilingual and intercultural education into syllabi and curricula means also to see that in the perspective of plurilingual and intercultural education in all kinds of education. Together with my colleague Marisa Cavalli, we have tried to visualize the mindset which is required in order to implement this. What we see here is dimensions of plurilingual and intercultural education. It is a butterfly, and we are inspired semantically here by Bernard Pottier. What we see here, of course, is the body. This is teacher education. These are individual methods of teaching and learning, and always following a global and decompartmentalized vision of languages. We see the linguistic dimension in all subject matters. And then the wings of the butterfly, that's a transversal aspect in all subject matters of reflection and of the awareness-raising dimension, the cultural and plurilingual dimension, the cognitive and cultural dimension. And you see here in blue the left wing and in yellow the right wing. These are values of culture of democracy and democratic culture. Then in the heart and middle we see the values which I've just been addressing. The antennae then, if we want to say so, they show pedagogical sensitivity which is so required for teachers and learners. So let's rethink teacher education from the perspective of plurilingual and intercultural education. This also means, of course, that plurilingual and intercultural education play a crucial role in the curricula of student teachers and future teachers in all subject matters of the curriculum as regards the linguistic dimension. The explanatory memorandum says that The successful implementation of plurilingual and intercultural education for democratic culture depends crucially on teachers, regardless of the subjects that they are teaching. They are the agents of change. It is thus essential that teacher education helps them to develop the necessary professional competencies. And of particular importance is also the transfer of competencies and strategies between languages. This, to me, means that we have different ways of introducing such plurilingual and intercultural education into training syllabi. First, it is of course possible to include these principles by wording objectives of specific competencies or skills. Today, very often curricula rely on key or target competencies or skills, and here we can introduce the principles of plurilingual and intercultural education. It is also possible to include some specific principles into existing modules that regards language didactics, language courses, education, and also the didactics of other subject matters. Furthermore, it is also possible to develop specific modules or sequences dedicated to the linguistic dimension in all subject matters or to the experience of plurilingual and intercultural education which exists already. And finally, there is one major dimension, that's the promotion of collaboration between educators and teachers in all subject matters, the linguistic ones and the so-called non-linguistic ones. The recommendation speaks about several instruments of the Council of Europe. I'd like to address two of them specifically, which can have an implication as to reshaping pathways for teacher education. First, the Guide of Teaching or Teachers' Competencies for Languages in Education. This is a platform made available by the ECML. It is a platform which can be used as a reference tool or as a framework covering all fields of language education. What this guide delivers is kind of an inventory of reference material which allows to rethink teacher education from the perspective of plurilingual and intercultural education. And there are the 5 dimensions, there are 5 different dimensions on this platform. So a catalog of instruments or tools with an analysis of each one of the tools indicating its use. Then there is a document which is kind of a summary of the results of the project. Then tools, instruments and principles of the Council of Europe. And here I'd like to draw your attention to something of a practical nature. That platform also delivers scenarios which can be used in practice, in practical work, mainly instruments of the Council of Europe, but also of some other European reference work and even beyond Europe. One of them is, of course, Jan's testimony, a teacher trainer in the field of foreign languages, secondary level, lower secondary as it were, in Switzerland. There some college, lower secondary teachers are educated in the field of foreign languages and also in some other subject matters. The idea being that such a fictitious teacher can then draft a coherent curriculum for education in the field of foreign language teachers, where activities, tools, pathways are described as to initial and further education. And then there is a lot of reference work, mainly the European Common Framework of Reference and its companion volume. Further, there is FREPA, CARAP, a reference framework for pluralistic approaches, and there are some more. And here, all languages, of course, are addressed on an equal footing. Then, there are some further tools, like the profiles of language competencies specific to foreign language teachers, the so-called Profil Swiss. Then there is a competence reference work as to the tactics of intercomprehension called Myriadi, because in Switzerland one learns two foreign languages, and intercomprehension is so important in our country, and it's also important for the new pathway and program of teacher education. And then there is also the reference work teaching so-called non-linguistic subject matters while taking into account their linguistic dimension. There is a summary list of such, and this relates to all school subject matters, and in brackets all resources are also mentioned at the end of the presentation, which will then also be available in PDF format. And this tool here is also called Handbook Language Dimensions in All Subjects in English. And here you see one of the analyses which is given in that tool. There are several dimensions, and you see the importance of that tool for the drafting of a curriculum on the basis of objectives as to competencies or skills following the principle of intercultural and plurilingual education. The second tool or material I'd like to mention is a guide for developing and implementing curricula for plurilingual and intercultural education. That tool allows to better articulate and unite languages at school and teacher education programs. Of course, always following the principles of the education we are speaking about. There is chapter 211, and there is also Annex 2. Both are dedicated to teacher education programs. That much in a wider sense on some aspects of plurilingual and intercultural education. That much on training models, and I should now like to speak about some things of a more concrete and tangible nature. Some systematic examples for the implementation of initial and further education. First, I'm speaking from my own experience as a teacher educator, but I'll also address some further examples of such tools. The first example, working on the representations of plurilingualism in the field of action research in initial education. Example 2, prepare, accompany and follow mobility of teachers in the so-called pedagogical biplane. Example 3, collaborating across subject matters in teacher education, how to integrate projects of plurilingual classrooms in education. And example number 4, support to digital development in teacher education. The first example speaks about a module of work which I've been using in education for many years. It's individual research work in the field of initial education at the Haute École Pédagogique Where I work, these are bachelor studies, normally second and third year, in French as a foreign language. It's about observation and analysis of written or oral production in French as a foreign language of one or two learners at an interval of 3 months with a non-deficit approach. The learners have selected lectures on developing of interlanguage and plurilingualism and some further topics upon their discretion, like error analysis or strategies as to code switching and so on. And they are encouraged to take into account all resources of the repertoire in the development of interlanguage. In that field, they have to develop an observation grid, which sometimes then becomes a formal assessment grid. I'll show you an example of that soon. Here there is an example of a text written by a pupil in French as a foreign language. She went into the zoo Lange Erle in Basel in Switzerland, and then at the end of the second year of learning, the learners had to write text about that excursion to the zoo. For them it was a major challenge, of course, because they had not yet the necessary tools for that, and as you can see here, they produced something where they used also some words of a different language, like there are some German words in between the French text. There is a learner speaking English and German at home and had not had any foreign language education, and still it was an English speaking child from the beginning. You see what is written here.
Petit monkey. Donc des singes. Je promène ABC, je take un glacé, je marche weiter, donc je continue à marcher, weiter en allemand, et je vois Vögel, des oiseaux, etc. Donc c'est un texte où on pourrait souligner tous les mots d'une autre
So you
langue.
see that this is a text where you can underline in red all words from a different language, saying it is an error. What was done here is the child tried to think of an assessment grid, more or less, where she gives a role to those elements of other languages. So, for instance, competence or skill, I use French words in order to write the text. And if not so many words from a different language are used, one gets more points. For instance, 0, 1, 2, 3. You can read these columns here. In that context, the context of learning French, you see that this is a strategy, but there are more points received when more French words are used. On the other hand, points are also allocated for certain aspects which are part of learning objectives. Mainly, for instance, the use of adjectives, verbs, and names of animals. So what you see here is a means of integrating the plurilingual dimension, still, of course, not losing sight of the purpose, which is to learn good French. And of course, one possibility among many, in order to encourage reflection as to that tool, is what we see here. There is the technique of action research. There are several assessment techniques and methods. There are representations of plurilingualism, for instance, which is something which I've just addressed, and also which is addressed in the recommendation. There are of course many other ways of doing that, and there are also many people listening to me now having their own methods. Let me just mention two types of material which are also mentioned in the recommendation. For instance, teaching module 3, calling into question preconceived ideas, meaning very often there is some bias as to languages of origin, for instance. and the material action research communities for language teachers, which exist in English and in German, and which gives kind of a framework in order to encourage to use action research techniques. The second example speaks about teacher mobility. This is, and we have heard it before, one of the objectives of plurilingual and intercultural education, the idea being to promote mobility in teacher education, and this is a framework which can help teachers to develop plurilingual and intercultural competencies. It's also a framework which encourages reflection and taking into account one's own learning process, metalinguistic and metacultural reflection, and also gives support to teachers when it comes to developing necessary pedagogical competence in order to manage linguistic and cultural difference. I've been able to work with some colleagues on a project dedicated to these topics. That was the Plurimobile project. Plurimobile has as its basis the idea that teachers have to be prepared, accompanied and followed. You find that of course also in the literature, and you see that mobility can be used and is very advantageous in education, particularly when focusing on these three aspects. And there are some scenarios and lesson plans for primary, lower and upper secondary learners, and also for teacher education. Plurimobile allows to fix clear objectives for linguistic, intercultural and strategic learning during a stay. Linguistic, intercultural and strategic. Encourages observation, analysis and reflection capacity, and also helps to discuss and take stock of what has been discovered and learned. That pädagogischer Doppeldecker, Biplan pédagogique, pedagogical biplane, as we call it, is what we see here. It's a double scenario which shows that this teaching practice always has a before, a during and an after. And these three phases are shown here and use Council of Europe's tools, particularly the Autobiography of Intercultural Encounters and the European Portfolio of Languages, because these tools can help reflect on culture and identity, can help define linguistic objectives, and can describe an intercultural encounter. During a mobility program, there is kind of a learning logbook where objectives are followed by means of the ELP and by means of the ARI. An intercultural encounter in mobility is described. Furthermore, one reflects on one's own learning scenario. One presents and reflects on one's ELP and one's autobiography, and what is important as to that biplane, there is a transfer to future school practice, because a scenario of learning is developed for future learners by using plurimobile. That's for the future learners then. Together with Lukas Bleichenbach and with Frener, we have described an example of a practical example of this module of plurimobile. Here we see how mobility in teacher education can be accompanied and can be seen as a complex process of mediation plurimobile takes up what is necessary in practical work. So, for instance, teachers not having had much time in further education, mainly of reading those key instruments. That's important. Then also in initial education of teachers, it means one has to reflect on mediation processes. It also means that some reflection can be held also on the level of tools which can be used for so doing. So there are reflective activities which are implemented by plurimobile, reflective or meta-reflective activities, but there is more to this. It can also be, of course, anthropological, linguistic, sociological, or didactic terms or notions, and the future teachers can also use some ethnographic methods of research or field studies. So the perspective is wide and is opened up towards some further explanations, which can be found in the references which you find here at the bottom of this slide. Over to example number 3. This is collaboration across subject matters in teacher education, integration of projects of plurilingual classrooms in education. There are 3 types of modules here in such education, which I'm using or building up, or with which I've been working at my education institution. The first one is the idea of such îlots immersive islands, if you will, of French as a foreign language in modules of DDNL, non-linguistic subject matters, didactics. So, for instance, in French and addressed to the students and related, say, to geography. And at the same time, when those immersive islands are used in French, they can be used later on by the learners when they are in immersion or submersion. And here one speaks about the tool of such an îlot immersive. It's one type of cooperation, immersive islands. The second type of collaboration between didactic of languages of schooling, here German, and the foreign languages, here English and French. That's a module with the implementation of a plurilingual project in classrooms. It's accompanied by a resource, by some material, which is an itinerant exhibition as to multilingualism in Switzerland. For instance, travel or language treasure that's adapted, of course, to a primary level audience. In that module, there are some lesson plans, some lectures, for instance, and then later on it can be implemented in a concrete, practical primary classrooms where the languages of origin of the learners on the primary level are valued, where languages are compared. That is a way along language awareness. One more module which is being created now, it's kind of a new conquest, so to speak. We are trying to draft a whole module which does not yet exist on the linguistic dimension of all subject matters. That's a module where teachers of so-called didactic, linguistic didactics, language of schooling, and so-called non-linguistic matters, didactics like geography, physics, and so on collaborate, and this will then be an official module.
Et j'en viens au dernier exemple.
And the fourth and last example, support to digital development in teacher education. This is certainly among the most important aspects. It's of key importance in order to develop digital literacy and digital citizenship in teacher education, because here the teachers themselves will then have to roll out that in classroom work, because otherwise social inequality might be perpetuated or even aggravated. This of course also depends on technical possibilities at schools, but in teacher education there is a key role of mediators in that process. During the pandemic, it has also been possible to develop our competencies in IT, and we have been implementing some hybrid models or completely online models, and that in order to make this an object of reflection in the field of teacher initial and further education. So there is much more attention now as to all dimensions which are implied here. In the future, it will also be important to bring to bear much more digital tools in online meetings for formats of authentic communication, and to make this an object of reflection. And here there is excellent ECML material, eLang, covering exactly this aspect. One has also to, or one should also, utilize plurilingualism in the web by means of targeted tools. Here again there is ECML material, the inventory of ICT tools and open educational resources. This means that IT resources can and should be used for new approaches like intercomprehension, and there is also myriad material as regards intercomprehension. With the revolution of ChatGPT, one can also have kind of a defensive approach, just saying, what do we do? All exams will now actually be written by ChatGPT. That's of course one possibility, but it's much better to train teachers so that they can also use artificial intelligence wisely and know how to react when their learners do so. And here again there is some work at the Haute École Pédagogique Sava Aloati. You will find the link in the presentation. And finally, there is a new material of the Council of Europe. That's the project Education for Digital Citizenship. Here one speaks about rights and duties as to the ethical and also skills aspects for future teachers and learners when it comes to the field of digital citizenship. That's more or less it, dear listeners and viewers. Let me maybe go over to a short summary and some conclusions. The first question was, what are the specific recommendations as regards teacher education? Let's listing them quite briefly, and here we speak about the pivotal role and the principle of plurilingual and intercultural education in teacher education curricula. One should call into question attitudes and beliefs as regards plurilingualism and interculturalism. One should develop plurilingual and intercultural competencies of the teachers. There should be a link to practical work in classroom and also to the necessary didactic competences in order to manage cultural and linguistic diversity. That is the idea to foster a culture of democracy in classroom, learner autonomy, critical mindset, and the learners' voices, adaptation to assessment practices, and of these, fostering mobility, and finally, the implementation of action research skills. Those 9 measures relate to the dimensions we are speaking about. Second, the next question, what are implications as to teacher education programs or curricula? What is important here is to use an approach based on objectives for competences and skills. There are resources made available by the Council of Europe, and there is also, of course, their integration as to certain levels of practical implementation. That can be specific points, or it can be a collaboration of a wider nature. Then I've covered some examples of the implementation, mainly action research based or mobility in education of teachers, mediation aspects, some pedagogical tools in agreement with the principles of plurilingual and intercultural education. I've then addressed the creation of modules and sequences allowing to collaborate across subject matters within an institution. This also covers the linguistic dimension in all subject matters of a syllabus. Furthermore, there is the integration and valuing of languages of the learners. That also regards classroom practice. And finally, there is the training to literacy, digital literacy, which will certainly also be very important in the field of processes which are crucial, but which should, of course, not hide all other dimensions which we have just been covering. It is indeed important to link this in the future to the global concept of plurilingual repertoires as regards the integration and inclusion of all languages, because that relates to identities and cultures and to the intercultural dialogue as such. In order to round this up, let me say we can and should use the recommendation at institutions of teacher education as a support for the implementation of principles of plurilingual and intercultural education. If we follow those principles, they have to be lived and have to be alive at the institutions. They have to be embedded into a conducive framework, and there has to be an adapted style of education, and this always means a critical mindset and a reflective approach. And for that transfer from theory to practice, it's so important to see a concrete linkage to practical classroom work. And finally, what remains and is so important as well is to encourage critical reflection of teachers and future teachers on the basis of didactic, linguistic, sociological and psychological literature as regards plurilingual and intercultural education in itself. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thanks indeed, dear Mirjam. Maybe you could now close your screen. Thanks indeed. Very kind of you. I'm fully convinced that our viewers and listeners will agree to me when I say that your presentation has allowed us to better understand what this recommendation is supposed to mean in the field of teacher education, and that not only related to language teachers but also for teachers of all other subject matters. You've shared some examples of the implementation in your own context. It is about some initiatives which had existed before the recommendation already, which shows that even if a lot still needs to be done, favorable changes have been launched already. I'm convinced that those examples will be so inspiring to many, and there will be some more examples. You've been mentioning several ECML resources and material, and also in the field of the Strasbourg's language policy program. And I'd like to wind up this presentation by telling our audience that the Council of Europe have so many resources and material contributing to a high quality language education. And the explanatory memorandum, as you have said, Mirjam, is an excellent starting point. And as a matter of fact, you see that all sections of education are covered, and that by means of some elements which make mention of tools of the Council of Europe. The thematic topics of the Council of Europe and the ECML are another point of departure, and here let me just very briefly show you my screen. Just a second, if you will. Here you find not only some tools, but also some information on possibilities as to the thematic fields in order to do some capacity building. We call this here training and consultancy activities. These are activities which take place in the member states and where some tangible topics on the basis of ECML resources are covered but adapted to the specific needs in specific contexts of the member states. So please do delve deeply into that rich treasure. Now we have a few moments in order to also reply to your questions. I'll see whether there are some in the chat. Yes, there is one. And the question is asked in English and it's quite long, so I'm not trying to translate it, but we have our interpreter for that.
The Council of Europe recommend all nations to enable students with minority languages to choose that language as a school subject. The problem is mainly a logistic one. No teachers available, the schedule. I realise this is not the main topic of today's webinar, but it lies at the heart of the problem. Schools are not urged to offer more languages. The internet and a European platform, could they be a possible solution? I can add to your reply, Mirjam, if you'd like to say a few words first.
Oui, volontiers.
Yes, of course, my pleasure. It is true that this is a field which is widely covered by some institutions which are not part of teacher education, institutions of a state or country, but they normally are part of what is taught or addressed elsewhere. But what you can see here is that quite often some specific objectives are followed, which I've not covered here, but which should of course also be addressed, and where it is of course necessary to have a webinar of its own. The internet maybe is a solution, I do not know. It could be one, for instance, for online education programs, and of course there have to be some aspects of training which are covered here. So one can, of course, include and integrate teacher education as to languages of origin also. That should take place at local teacher education centers, but one should maybe also reflect on some solutions, maybe also online, why not? Thanks indeed, Mirjam. And maybe I can add something. These questions of the importance of regional and minority languages will be a topic of a colloquium here at the ECML in November. And it is an activity which we will organize as part of our agreement with the European Union, and it's a question of how one can give more space to these languages which are so important. So we of course are highly indebted to those having brought up this topic. It's so important, and I can only invite you to always see ECML news in order to receive more information on that colloquium in November this year. So thank you very much indeed for this question. And this now is also the moment where I should tell you, to all of you, that we are just launching our call for proposals for new ECML projects for the next 4-year program of the European Centre for Modern Languages. It will be launched on the 15th of May, and it will be open until the 31st of August. So please do consult the ECML website, and if you have innovative and interesting ideas in order to foster plurilingual and intercultural education, I can only cordially invite you to participate in that call for proposals of projects. The ECML will continue this series of webinars on the recommendation. The next webinar will be organized in autumn and will lay emphasis on more generic implications of the recommendation on society and on how society in the wider sense can and must participate in its success. Let me thank you once again. Thank you for having listened in, and the slides and the recording will soon be online and available on our website. Thanks indeed to Mirjam, and also thanks to my ECML colleagues. Then see you next time. Thanks to all of you. Au revoir.